On August 6, 1963, in Windsor, Ontario, Canada, an article revealed that Joseph Zerilli, a former Prohibition-era beer baron from Detroit, had been named as the city's crime syndicate leader in a recent exposé based on testimony from Mafia informant Joseph Valachi. Zerilli, now a successful businessman, denied any involvement with the Mafia or Cosa Nostra, despite Valachi's claims to U.S. authorities that Zerilli was a key figure in organized crime. The article highlighted Zerilli's criminal past, the Mafia's extensive influence, and the ongoing efforts of the FBI to safeguard Valachi, who faced threats for exposing the inner workings of the syndicate. Detroit resident named as head of Syndicate Detroit's beer baron of the Prohibition era, Joseph Zerilli, has been named Detroit's current syndicate crime chief in a magazine article. The Post bases its story on revelations by Joseph Valachi to the U.S. Justice Department on organized crime in America. Valachi, who is being guarded by Federal Bureau of Investigation agents, is an old-time syndicate member and has been sharing his knowledge of the underworld with authorities for the past year. Zerilli, of 702 Middlesex, Grosse Pointe Park, was reached at his vacation home at Higgins Lake and denied any knowledge of Cosa Nostra, Italian for our thing, of which he is alleged to be a ruler. "If my name is in there, it must be a mistake," he said. "I don't know anything about this Cosa Nostra. I've never heard of the organization or any of these men." The men named with him as members of the Deadly Council. Born in Palermo, Sicily, 65 years ago, Zerilli came to Detroit in 1914 and became a naturalized citizen in 1938. He is said to have been the leader of an East Side gang in the late 1920s and early 1930s that dealt in illicit whiskey, narcotics, and gambling. Often arrested on charges as serious as armed robbery and murder, he's been convicted only twice, once for speeding and once for carrying a concealed weapon. His annual income is estimated at more than $100,000. Today, Zerilli is the owner of the Detroit Italian Baking Company and has financial interests in Melrose Linen Service, Inc. and Lakeshore Coach Lines, Inc. "I've been in the bakery business for 36 years, he maintained. According to the Post article, Valachi's revelations have already triggered more than a dozen FBI investigations that are yielding results and are likely to lead to new legislation to fill gaps in existing laws. Valachi, who is now serving a 15-year sentence in an undisclosed federal prison, described the Mafia as a headless organization with units called families in 12 major cities. All members must be of Italian parentage on both sides. The article also noted that Valachi's testimony has solved several underworld mysteries, including the assassination of Albert Anastasia and the 1957 attempt on Frank Costello's life. According to Valachi, the latter was engineered by Vito Genovese, who is now imprisoned. Anastasia's murder led to the Mafia conclave at Appalachian, New York. Meanwhile, an informant has told officials that the underworld has set a price of $100,000 on Valachi's head for betraying the Mafia. "We're going to keep him alive," one government source said. "We don't know exactly what we're going to do with him, but we're going to keep him in a safe place." The Mafia, according to the article, controls some of the biggest businesses in the country: narcotics, gambling, shakedowns, rackets, and money lending, grossing about 10% of the national income, or approximately $40 billion a year. Valachi has identified the 12 family bosses who make up the Mafia's Grand Council and described them as so greedy and hungry for the buck that they no longer require Mafia candidates to kill for the organization. Zerilli also claimed that he had never heard of the 60-year-old Valachi and knew nothing about the Detroit underworld. Known as Mr. Joe during the Prohibition era, Zerilli was regarded as Detroit's beer baron. Today, he maintains that his life and business are legitimate. On August 6, 1963, an article revealed that Joseph Zerilli, a former Prohibition-era beer baron, had been identified as Detroit's crime syndicate chief in a report by the Saturday Evening Post. The story was based on testimony from Mafia informant Joseph Valachi, who had been cooperating with the US Justice Department to expose the inner workings of Cosa Nostra. Despite Zerilli's denial of any involvement with the Mafia, he was named as a key figure in organized crime, with ties to Detroit's underworld dating back decades. Authorities continued to investigate the claims, which linked Zerilli to a national crime network controlled by top Mafia leaders. Undoubtedly, crime czar of Detroit is named. Joseph Zerilli, a Prohibition-era figure, has been named in a national magazine as Detroit's syndicate crime chief. The story is based on the disclosures of Joseph Valachi, an old-time syndicate member who has been sharing everything he knows about organized crime in America with the Justice Department for the past year. Zerilli, of 702 Middlesex, Grosse Pointe Park, is named in the story as a ruler of Cosa Nostra, which is Italian for our thing. FBI agents are guarding the 60-year-old Valachi pending his appearance before Senator John L. McClellan's subcommittee, which is scheduled to resume its probe into the illegal narcotics trade. The Saturday Evening Post reported that intensive FBI work has led to the identification of Zerilli as the Cosa Nostra ruler in Detroit. Zerilli was reached at his vacation home at Higgins Lake. "If my name is in there, the Post, it must be a mistake," he said. "I don't know anything about this, Cosa Nostra. I've never heard of the organization or any of these men, the men who were named with him as members of a deadly council in the Post." Zerilli said he has never heard of Valachi and knows nothing about Detroit's underworld. "I've been in the bakery business for 36 years, he said. He owns the Detroit Italian Baking Co., located at 10932 Shoemaker. He also has financial interests in Melrose Linen Service, Inc., at 4630 Crane, and Lakeshore Coach Lines, Inc., at 1840 Edel. Known as Mr. Joe during Prohibition days, Zerilli was regarded as Detroit's beer baron. He was born in Palermo, Sicily, 65 years ago, ran away from home, and came to America to live with a sister in Detroit in 1914. He became a naturalized American citizen in 1938. Zerilli is said to have been the leader of an East Side gang in the late 1920s and early 1930s that dealt in illicit whiskey, narcotics, and gambling. He was often arrested on charges ranging from disorderly conduct to armed robbery and murder. However, he was convicted only twice, once for carrying a concealed weapon and once for speeding. He later had his record expunged, as was his right under the law. He now has an estimated annual income of more than $100,000, according to informed sources. Edwin O. Guthman, the Justice Department's Public Information Director, said Valachi's accounts of organized crime have been corroborated by other sources and investigations. Valachi has provided the government with this picture. At the top, a ruling council known as the Commission, with Vito Genovese, a 66-year-old Italian-born narcotics boss who is now serving a 15-year sentence in the Atlanta Reformatory, as the chief. The members of this council, known as bosses, serve as heads of crime families in cities across the nation. The families control organized crime in their areas. Individual mobs within the families pay part of their profits from narcotics, gambling, and vice to the families. The commission determines which families get which crime concessions and also resolves disputes over the division of spoils. Investigators have been told that Cosa Nostra also operates loan shark businesses, extorts money from businesses and labor unions, and invests the profits in legitimate enterprises. When informed that the Post article linked Zerilli to the National Crime Syndicate, Police Commissioner George Edwards remarked, "It comes as no surprise to us." "We would like very much to talk to Valachi," Edwards added. "He may be able to provide some very important missing links." Zerilli and his wife, the former Rosalie Profaci, have 3 daughters and a son, Anthony J. Zerilli, who is the vice president of the Hazel Park Racing Association. On August 7, 1963, an article from Windsor, Ontario, Canada, revealed that organized crime bosses had placed a $100,000 bounty on the head of Joseph Valachi, the government's top informant. Valachi, a former Mafia insider, had provided crucial intelligence to U.S. authorities, including naming key crime figures and exposing details of the 1957 Appalachian Mafia Summit. His testimony, hailed by Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy as a major breakthrough in combating organized crime, included insights into the murder of mobster Albert Anastasia and the ongoing power of Vito Genovese. The government vowed to protect Valachi, fearing for his life amid the Mafia's efforts to silence him. Mob puts $100,000 price. On head of informer, special to Newsday. Washington. Underworld bosses want Joseph Valachi, the government's #1 informer, dead. They're willing to pay $100,000 for the job, no questions asked. Government sources revealed the amount yesterday. We're going to take every precaution necessary to protect this man, a government spokesman said. If we let him out on the street, he'd be dead in half an hour. Valachi, after more than a year of federal interrogation, has provided the biggest intelligence breakthrough yet in combating organized crime in the United States, said Attorney General Robert F. Kennedy. Among his disclosures were the names of the 2 alleged killers of Albert, the executioner, Anastasia, and a detailed inside account of the 1957 Underworld Summit, the Appalachian Crime Convention. Valachi, a convicted narcotics dealer, named 12 men as members of the Grand Council of Organized Crime. He listed Vito Genovese, Joseph Bonanno, Carlo Gambino, Thomas Lucchese, and Joseph Magliocco, all from New York City. Valachi said Genovese, who is serving a 15-year sentence on narcotics charges in Atlanta Penitentiary, still controls the crime syndicate from behind prison walls. He named Sam Giancana as the crime boss in Chicago, Joseph Zerilli in Detroit, Sebastian LaRocca in Pittsburgh, Angelo Bruno in Philadelphia, Stefano Magadino in Buffalo, Raymond Patriarca in Boston, and John T. Scalish in Cleveland. Valachi, 58 years old, the American-born son of Italian immigrants, has vowed to tell everything before the Senate Permanent Investigation Subcommittee in an attempt to destroy his would-be killers. He reportedly revealed that the 2 men who killed Albert Anastasia in a hotel barbershop in 1957 were Ralph Mafrici, 31, and Joseph Joe Zerilli. Mafrici is currently serving a prison term for assault and robbery, and Zerilli has been missing since the summer of 1961 and is presumed dead. Justice Department spokesmen say that Valachi's testimony has also shed light on the attempt on the life of Frank Costello and the disappearance of Anthony Tony Bender Strollo. In a Saturday Evening Post article dated yesterday, Valachi stated that it was Vito Genovese, Valachi's former cellmate at the federal penitentiary in Atlanta, who ordered the slaying of Albert Anastasia because Anastasia killed left and right for nothing. Valachi reportedly is never at ease and constantly repeats, "I've never done this before." He had heard while in Atlanta prison that he had been marked for death by the Cosa Nostra syndicate as a suspected informer. In response, he attacked a convict whom he suspected of being his appointed executioner and killed him with a lead pipe. Valachi began talking to federal agents in hopes of receiving leniency in the killing case. He was subsequently sentenced to life imprisonment. On August 11, 1963, an article detailed the groundbreaking revelations of Joseph Valachi, a former member of the Mafia who broke the organization's code of silence, or omertà, to expose the inner workings of the notorious crime syndicate. Valachi, after spending more than 30 years as part of the Mafia, decided to testify publicly about the secretive organization's structure, operations, and violent history. His testimony, a major breakthrough for law enforcement, revealed the Mafia's complex network of families, its income-generating criminal activities, and the power struggle among its leaders. Despite a $100,000 bounty on his head, Valachi's decision to testify marked a turning point in the US government's fight against organized crime. Mobster loosens grip. Of Secret Ring, Mafia Crime Kin Exposed, by John Gerard, staff writer. Joseph Valachi knows all too well the evil power of the national crime syndicate, commonly called the Mafia, and more recently, Cosa Nostra. He knows how it can reach and kill even carefully guarded individuals who have been marked for death. Valachi knows this power because he was a part of it for more than 30 years. He admits to having participated in the violent deaths of several people that Cosa Nostra had decreed must be eliminated. Yet despite the danger, he is determined to defy the power of this feared syndicate. Valachi is breaking the Mafia's long-standing code of omerta, the rule of silence. He has already shared the almost unbelievable story of the National Crime Syndicate with agents of the Department of Justice in closely guarded offices. While the Attorney General's staff and the FBI were aware of some details about the Mafia, they were astounded by Valachi's revelations. Now Valachi is determined to tell his story publicly, possibly before the Senate Investigation Subcommittee hearings, so millions of people can learn the truth about the underworld lords who have grown rich from their criminal enterprises. Through news wires, the press, television, and radio, millions will hear the true story. The decision to testify publicly about the National Crime Syndicate was made by Valachi himself, according to a spokesman for the Department of Justice who spoke to News and Sun Sentinel this week. Patriots founded the Mafia. The Mafia, a secret criminal society originating in Sicily, once virtually ruled the island. It has been active in the United States for about 100 years. Originally, the Mafia was a patriot group formed to oppose tyranny. However, like many such organizations, it became a criminal gang after its original purpose was achieved. The Mafia was formed during the Napoleonic Wars of the early 19th century and fought against French and Spanish rule imposed on Sicily by Napoleon. After Italy became a united nation in 1860, the Mafia, which had virtually ruled Sicily as an unauthorized government, was unwilling to surrender its power. The organization then became an outlaw group, continuing to rule through terror, extortion, and violence. Palermo was the center of its power, and its influence spread throughout the island. In the 1920s, Mussolini moved against the Mafia, resulting in the arrest and imprisonment of hundreds of members. The Mafia might have been permanently crushed at that time, but Mussolini's forces overstepped, using the campaign as an opportunity to attack their personal enemies, which alienated many honest Sicilians who had supported the crackdown. The Mafia in America. The Mafia was brought to the United States by Sicilian immigrants and became strongest in New York City and New Orleans. In New Orleans, it carried out a widespread extortion racket, mainly targeting Sicilian and Italian immigrants. The Mafia came to the attention of the police in May 1890 when it ambushed and killed members of a rival Italian gang, the Bootlegger. In retaliation, the Mafia assassinated New Orleans Police Chief David Hennessy, leading to a public outcry and the formation of a vigilante committee that hanged 11 Mafia leaders. Valachi's breakthrough. Joseph Valachi, now under heavy security in a secret location, is well aware of the $100,000 bounty that has been placed on his head by the Mafia. Despite the threat, he is determined to testify. Valachi began talking to federal agents after realizing that Cosa Nostra had marked him for death, believing him to be an informer. In response, he killed another inmate at Atlanta Penitentiary, mistakenly thinking the man had been sent to execute him. Valachi's decision to turn informer marked a major breakthrough in the war on organized crime. He provided federal agents with inside information on the Mafia's structure and operations, naming names, dates, and places, and shedding light on numerous gangland killings, including the assassination of Albert Anastasia in a New York barbershop and the attempted murder of Frank Costello. The Mafia's structure. Valachi explained that the Mafia, or Cosa Nostra, is divided into units called families. Each family is headed by a capo, or boss, and operates in its own territory. Nationally, Cosa Nostra is governed by a council of 12 top capos, with Vito Genovese as the leading figure. The council settles disputes, approves new members, and decides when a capo's successor can take over. The Mafia's operations. The Mafia's income is generated from a variety of illicit activities, including narcotics trafficking, gambling, extortion, and the control of labor unions. One particularly lucrative racket is shylocking, or loan sharking, where funds are loaned at exorbitant interest rates of 20% per week. However, Valachi revealed that internal dissent has been brewing within the Mafia due to the greed of bosses like Genovese and Joseph Zerilli. Whereas the family's total earnings were once shared among all members, the bosses now keep the profits for themselves, causing discontent among lower-level members. The traditional head tax, which provided for legal defense and support for imprisoned soldiers' families, has also been discontinued. Despite these internal tensions, the Mafia remains a powerful and wealthy criminal organization. Authorities estimate that the Mafia generates an income of approximately $40 billion a year, about 10% of the national income. Much of this cost is passed on to ordinary citizens through higher prices as businesses are extorted or controlled by the Mafia. Joseph Valachi's testimony represents the first significant breach in the Mafia's wall of silence. Through his courage, law enforcement agencies are gaining valuable insights into the operations of the nation's most dangerous crime syndicate. On February 20, 1964, the Detroit Free Press reported that the Hazel Park Racing Association was cleared of Mafia infiltration allegations following a 4-month investigation by the Michigan Racing Commission. Former Detroit Police Commissioner George Edwards had previously testified before the McClellan Senate Investigation Subcommittee, accusing the track of being a prime example of Mafia influence. However, State Racing Commissioner Barry N. Beeman's report found no evidence to support these claims. Despite the familial ties of some racing association officers to known Mafia figures, the investigation concluded that the track was operating legally and efficiently, without any criminal activity linked to its leadership. Hazel Park track. Cleared of Mafia link. Charge. The Hazel Park Racing Association was given a clean bill of health on Wednesday by the Michigan Racing Commission. State Racing Commissioner Barry N. Beeman said that a 4-month investigation by his agents failed to uncover any evidence to substantiate former Police Commissioner George Edwards' charge that the track was a classic example of Mafia infiltration of legitimate enterprise. Governor Romney ordered the investigation after Edwards made the charge on October 10th, while testifying before the McClellan Senate Investigation Subcommittee. This state-licensed monopoly operation makes approximately $1 million a year, Edwards told the committee at that time. Much of this is available to further Mafia power in the Detroit area, he said. Edwards is now a judge of the U.S. 6th Circuit Court of Appeals in Cincinnati. In a report submitted last Friday to Governor Romney and made public on Wednesday, Beeman said, "It is my opinion that the Hazel Park Racing Association has conducted its racing operation in an efficient, lawful manner, in conformity with the rules and regulations of the Racing Commission and the statutes of the state. This opinion is confirmed by former racing commissioners and shows that none of the present officers and directors have been convicted of a crime." Beeman said his investigators checked into the relationship of Anthony J. Zerilli, Executive Vice President of the Racing Association, and his father, Joe Zerilli, whom Edwards named as one of the top leaders of the Detroit Mafia. He also noted that they looked into the relationship of Jack W. Tocco, a Racing Association Vice President and Director, and Anthony J. Tocco, also a director, with their father, William Black Bill Tocco, who was also named by Edwards as being one of the top 5 Detroit Mafia leaders. Other officers of the Racing Association include Richard A. Connell Sr., President, James V. Belanca, Board Chairman, Lester A. Smith, Vice President, Ralph G. Matkin, Treasurer, and Louis Elias, a Director. None of these individuals are known to be related to Mafia leaders named by Edwards. Beeman concluded in his report, "While it is a fact that the reputations and police records of some of the relatives of several officers and directors of the Hazel Park Racing Association leave much to be desired, an examination of police files and the conduct of the association's officers shows that none of the present officers or directors have violated the law or have been involved in any criminal activity." On May 28, 1964, the Tucson Daily Citizen reported that Joseph Bonanno, a reputed Cosa Nostra crime boss and part-time Tucson resident, was arrested in Montreal on charges of lying to Canadian officials about his criminal history and entering the country illegally without proper documents. Bonanno, who had been linked to the infamous Appalachian Crime Convention and accused by mob informant Joseph Valachi of leading one of New York's 5 major crime families, was remanded to jail for deportation to the United States. His trial was set for June 3rd, while Tucson Police Chief Bernard Garmier noted Bonanno had not been seen in Tucson for about a year, likely due to travel in Italy or Sicily. Bonanno jailed by Canadians, by Ace Bushnell. Sometime Tucson resident Joseph Bonanno, often linked with the Cosa Nostra crime syndicate, was arrested on 2 charges yesterday in Montreal, according to the Associated Press. The AP reported that the 59-year-old Bonanno was released on $2,000 bail on a charge of lying to Canadian officials by telling them he had never been convicted of a crime in the United States. His trial was set for June 3rd. However, he was remanded to jail on charges of entering Canada without a visa or medical clearance. He was held for deportation to the United States, the wire service said. Tucson Police Chief Bernard L. Garmier said he received several telephone calls last night from Milwaukee police officials, who informed him that Bonanno had entered Canada from a country other than the United States. Garmier said Bonanno, who owns a home at 1847 East Elm Street, has not been seen in the Tucson area for about a year. The chief mentioned that he had heard from reliable sources that Bonanno had been in Italy or Sicily, his birthplace, so it was presumed that his entry into Canada was from one of those places. "The Milwaukee police told me that Bonanno told the Canadians he is the owner of the Hilltop Hotel in Fort Lee, Arizona," Garmier said. "They asked me where Fort Lee is, but I told them to let me know if they find out. I can't locate it, or such a hotel." Bonanno was first arrested in Tucson in November 1958 by federal authorities for failure to report to a grand jury. In May 1959, federal authorities arrested him again and charged him with conspiring to commit perjury and obstruct justice in connection with the famous Appalachian New York Underworld Convention. He was never tried on those charges. Just last October, turncoat mobster Joseph Valachi told U.S. Senate investigators that his godfather, Bonanno, headed one of 5 Cosa Nostra families, or gangs in the New York area. The others named were Thomas Lucchese, Carlo Gambino, Joseph Magliocco, and Vito Genovese. In January, columnist Victor Riesel reported that the organized crime section of the Justice Department's Criminal Division now has 5 primary targets comprising a so-called nationwide commission. Riesel said Bonanno is one of the 5, along with Sam Giancana of Chicago, Steve Magadino of Lewiston, New York, Joe Zerilli of Detroit, and Genovese. FBI records show that Bonanno was convicted twice in 1942 of conspiracy charges in connection with violations of the wage and hour law. Some Saturday department and variety stores generally will be closed throughout the city Saturday in observance of Memorial Day. However, most major grocery markets, drug stores, and discount houses are planning to stay open. City, county, state, and federal agencies, usually closed on Saturdays, will operate only emergency services. There will be no garbage or trash pickup. Federal workers are being. On December 24, 1964, the Hillsdale Daily News published an article titled "Underworld Takes Over Legitimate Business" by Robert S. Allen and Paul Scott, detailing the alarming rise of mafia infiltration into legitimate businesses across the U.S. From banks to nightclubs, underworld figures, often through fronts, have taken control of enterprises ranging from real estate to trucking and food processing. Authorities are particularly concerned about the mafia's dominance in banking and loan sharking, which is generating staggering profits, with J. Edgar Hoover estimating that organized crime nets over $1 billion annually from loan sharking alone. The article highlights how the underworld's ruthless tactics, including brutal collection methods and foreclosures, have led to the takeover of hundreds of businesses, posing a growing economic threat to the nation. Underworld Takes Over. Legitimate Business by Robert S. Allen and Paul Scott. Underworld infiltration of legitimate businesses is now so widespread that hundreds of large and small enterprises throughout the country are either owned or controlled by vice elements. In this increasingly sinister trend, racketeers are turning to banks and loan institutions. Definitely known instances of this are the following. A bank in a prosperous Detroit suburb is in the grip of members of the Detroit Cosa Nostra. Henchmen of Joe Zerilli, a leader of the notorious mob, readily obtain loans from this bank with little or no security. A Virginia bank was systematically looted by two hoodlum gangs operating through an apparently respectable front. Using that device, a St. Louis racketeer is strongly suspected of dominating a bank in that area. Owning major interests in the First National Service and Discount Corporation in New York City were leading mafia members, among them Michael Genovese, younger brother of the notorious Vito Genovese, as testified during the New York State loan shark probe. In addition to moving into banking and lending, there is mounting hoodlum infiltration, chiefly through fronts, in other profitable business fields: real estate, auto agencies, building supplies, hotels and motels, trucking, clothing factories, food processors, dairies and dairy products, undertaking establishments, restaurants and nightclubs. One of the best-known Manhattan night spots is deemed racket-controlled. Local authorities have not yet been able to prove that, but they are fully convinced of it. Hoodlums have long had their tentacles on garbage and waste removal, laundries and linen services, vending machine enterprises, racetracks, resorts, entertainment agencies and entertainers, beverage concerns, both alcoholic and non-alcoholic. The extent of hoodlum infiltration into legitimate businesses is difficult to ascertain. There is no doubt of its magnitude and steady growth. But concrete statistics are difficult to detail because much of this activity is carried on through various kinds of fronts. Justice Department authorities roughly estimate these underworld interests amount to many hundreds of millions of dollars. Mobsters are financing their constantly expanding business holdings with huge incomes from organized crime, with gambling and loan sharking being the most profitable. From the latter alone, FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover estimates the underworld nets at least $1 billion a year. Gambling is characterized by him as being even more lucrative. There should be no doubt in the mind of anyone of the enormous profits which the organized underworld is reaping from gambling, said the noted veteran crime fighter. One bank in the New York area was taking in over $6 million a year. Chicago police, in February of this year, found $800,000 in the home of a recently deceased operator of a policy racket who was only a modest operator. This is the type of income which makes the organized underworld economically powerful. Although there is no enterprise, legal or illegal, which members of the organized underworld would shun, gambling remains its major source of wealth. Loan sharking is probably its next best producer. A typical illustration of the profits from loan shark operations was the salary of $1,000 a month the owner of a small Midwest business paid to a racketeer to whom he was in debt. This salary covered interest only and did not reduce the principal. In the end, the unfortunate small businessman lost his concern through foreclosure. Untold hundreds of businesses have fallen to underworld control through foreclosure by a loan shark, declared Hoover. There have been instances of loan sharks collecting as much as $100,000 on $10,000 loans. Collection methods used by loan sharks are ruthless and often brutal. Through such foreclosures and various other methods, including some legal, like purchase and creation, the organized underworld has effected considerable infiltration of the business world. Inroads have also been made in some labor unions. Some of the underworld's most important leaders have gained vast legitimate holdings. They operate these with the same unscrupulous methods they use in their illegal activities, and they are a growing economic threat to our nation. In the East, the going interest rate on Shylock loans is around 20% a week. The rate is slightly lower if the borrower is another Shylock. Some underworld financiers operate solely as Shylocks for the Shylocks. Collection methods are ruthless. Debtors unable to meet the exorbitant interest rates are subjected to severe beatings, often maimed and sometimes killed. Others are intimidated through threats against their families and relatives. A borrower who has obtained $1,000 from a Shylock is usually expected to pay back $1,200 after 1 week. If he can't repay the loan entirely, the interest, or vigorish as it's called, alone will be accepted. If no payment is made, the total amount due doubles in 5 weeks. On February 14, 1965, the Rochester Democrat and Chronicle published an article titled "Underworld Expands Its Grip on Business" by Robert S. Allen and Paul Scott, detailing the alarming spread of mafia infiltration into legitimate businesses across the country. With organized crime reaping billions annually from gambling, loan sharking, and narcotics, law enforcement agencies, led by U.S. Attorney Robert M. Morgenthau, have identified mafia control over enterprises ranging from real estate to skyscrapers in New York. The mafia's strategic use of dummy fronts has allowed it to conceal ownership and corrupt businesses undetected, while Joseph Valachi's testimony has exposed hundreds of mafia members. Despite increasing law enforcement pressure, the mafia continues to expand its influence, employing an estimated 750,000 non-members in various criminal ventures, from bookmaking to business manipulations, posing a significant threat to the national economy. Underworld Expands Its Grip on Business by Robert S. Allen and Paul Scott. Surreptitious activities have come to light, but investigating bodies have been informed that organized gambling involves $7 billion a year, loan sharks take $1 billion, and the narcotics trade amounts to $350 million annually. Information on these activities is being compiled for grand juries. Tomorrow, a classic case of a business takeover will culminate in the sentencing of 3 members of the Mafia in New York federal court. Peter Castellana, a member of the Gambino Mafia family and second cousin to its leader, Carlo Gambino, along with other officers of the Murray Packing Company in the Bronx, face fines of up to $5,000 on each of 8 counts, plus 5 years in prison. The company itself faces a $10,000 fine. The extent of these operations may be gauged by reports from law enforcement that the Mafia is now believed to control one of the tallest skyscrapers in New York. United States Attorney Robert M. Morgenthau, who has 3 grand juries investigating the Mafia, has discovered that real estate is a favored field of operation for the gangs, as the use of dummy fronts has long been accepted, even in legitimate realty transactions. Dummy fronts, used in business. Using dummy fronts, the true owners of a business, those who put up the money, never have to list themselves as owners, partners, or even as being involved in any way. Such fronts are useful not only in real estate, but also in other businesses. Gangsters operating behind dummies who have no criminal records can corrupt legitimate businesses before their connection is detected. In such setups, it is difficult for the government to even prove that a gangster is involved in a legitimate business, let alone prove that he has broken the law. The House Banking Committee plans to begin public hearings soon on the mounting evidence that underworld gangsters are moving into legitimate banking to help finance and control their criminal activities. Representative Wright Patman, a Democrat from Texas and chairman of the committee, declined to discuss details but claimed he could show that racketeers have bought out some banks, lock, stock, and barrel. Mafia not unhindered. However, the Mafia is not proceeding without resistance. Federal and local law enforcement agencies have inflicted more punishment on its members in the past 12 months than in any previous year. Valachi identifies 317 members. Since Joseph M. Valachi, a convicted narcotics dealer and murderer, turned against the Mafia and helped identify 317 members in late 1963, authorities have identified 1,500 members of the 5 New York families of the organization. The secret organization is believed to have at least 5,000 members throughout the United States, and they have been subjected to increased pressure. This is indicated by figures cited by Nicholas Katzenbach, the United States Attorney General, showing federal convictions for gambling, narcotics, bootlegging, prostitution, public corruption, syndicate-operated frauds, labor management, and other racket crimes. There were 45 such convictions in 1960 and more than 500 last year. Additionally, the Senate Investigating Subcommittee has been active. Part of its forthcoming report will be based on information developed since Valachi broke the underworld code and testified before the committee in open session in 1963. Detective Sergeant Ralph Salerno, an expert on the Mafia in the Police Department's Central Investigation Bureau, stated that it took a long time for the public and many law enforcement officials to accept that crime was organized on a national scale. For too many years, he declared, we were called cloak and dagger detectives for insisting there was a criminal organization with ties across the country. I'm not just talking about an apathetic public, but also about police officers and enforcement officials who would not or could not accept the evidence. Salerno said the modern Mafia engages in a cradle-to-grave scheme to drain the national economy of billions. They're involved in nearly everything, from kiddie ride parks to pension funds, the sergeant said. You can't overestimate the areas they're moving into. They don't usually come in with guns, but with money, lots and lots of money from gambling and narcotics, to take over legitimate businesses. Murder rate decreases. Hoods like Dutch Schultz never went anywhere without 2 bodyguards. Today's bosses of organized crime have a lawyer and an accountant instead. There are fewer murders now, usually limited to suspected informers, except during intra-family power struggles, such as when the Gallo boys in Brooklyn rebelled against Joe Profaci. The strength of the Mafia does not mean that Italians have a monopoly on organized crime. It simply indicates that the Italian criminals had a greater talent for organization than the Irish, Jewish, and German gangs. They fought for control of bootleg liquor and other rackets in New York and other cities during Prohibition. Mafia business expansion. The organization has a working relationship with other criminal organizations made up of people from various ethnic and religious backgrounds, according to William G. Hundley, chief of the Organized Crime and Racketeering Section of the Department of Justice in Washington. It is estimated that as many as 750,000 non-members are employed in Mafia enterprises or associated with them in joint ventures. This includes collectors, runners, and other workers in bookmaking and numbers of rackets, narcotics pushers, hired thugs, agents for loan sharks, and fronts for countless business manipulations. Because many mafia operations span state lines, many major cases have been developed by federal agencies. However, district attorneys in metropolitan areas of New York and New Jersey are coordinating their work with federal authorities and are prosecuting mafia members for violations of state laws. On May 15, 1966, the Kansas City Star published a condensed version of Panic in Chicago's Mafia, an article from the Saturday Evening Post, revealing the rising tension within the mafia due to new legal strategies employed by the U.S. government. The article highlighted the imprisonment of Chicago mob boss Sam Giancana on contempt of court charges, marking a shift in how the government was able to target top mafia leaders. This crackdown on the Chicago Mafia, considered the most powerful Cosa Nostra family in the U.S., underscored the national implications, including potential links between the crime syndicates in Chicago and Kansas City. The article explored how government tactics, such as penetrating the mafia's layers of protection and addressing witness intimidation, were beginning to strike fear into the once seemingly untouchable mob hierarchy. New legal tool strikes panic in Mafia. Condensed from Panic in Chicago's Mafia, an article in the May 21, 1966, issue of the Saturday Evening Post by Bill Davidson, a Post editor-at-large, and Sandy Smith, a reporter for the Chicago Sun-Times. There is strong reason to believe there are links between the organized criminal underworlds of Chicago and Kansas City as part of a national crime syndicate. Like Chicago, Kansas City also is one of the target cities of the government's organized crime drives. Copyright 1966, The Saturday Evening Post. Death row in Chicago's Cook County Jail consists of 3 cells in the basement, with cell number 3 only 20 feet from the electric chair. During June and part of July 1965, cell number 2 had an extremely unusual tenant, a short, bald, gargoyle-faced, beak-nosed man wearing an expensive grey silk business suit instead of the usual prison garb. In his dark 8 by 10-foot cell, flanked by 2 convicted murderers, he alternately raged at his guards in terrible outbursts of temper and lay on his bunk repeating, as if to reassure himself, "I won't talk." This man was not a convicted murderer awaiting execution, but a federal prisoner, temporarily being held in maximum security. He could not mingle with other prisoners or even make use of the prison laundry. He had to wash his imported silk shorts and socks by hand in the wash basin of his cell. In July, the authorities decided they could ease up on security and moved him from death row to a cell in the federal tier of the jail. He has been there ever since. By the end of this month, when he is due for release, he will have spent almost a year in jail. The astonishing thing about this prisoner's case, however, is not the duration of his confinement, but the fact that he is behind bars at all. The inmate is Momo Salvatore, Sam Giancana, boss of bosses of the Cosa Nostra in Chicago and a member of the 12-man High Commission of the Mafia in America. Although he rules a $2 billion a year crime empire dealing in such commodities as murder, narcotics, prostitution, usury, and extortion, the law had not been able to lock him up since he did time for an armed burglary in 1943, when he was just a junior hood with ambitions. The jailing of Giancana, for contempt of court, followed a dramatic change in strategy by the Department of Justice in its war on organized crime. Early last year, the federal government quietly launched a major attack on the Cosa Nostra's Chicago branch, the most powerful and monolithic mafia family in the United States. And its victories there have already helped shape its strategy against the mafia elsewhere. What makes these victories especially significant is that they have been won against top leaders of the mob rather than mere underlings. Not only has the boss of bosses himself gone to jail, but one of his principal lieutenants, underbosses in the Cosa Nostra, has been sentenced to 4.5 years in prison, and another is now awaiting sentencing, possibly for as long as 20 years. This series of defeats for the mafia leadership of a single city within little more than a year is probably unprecedented. Until recently, the men who run the Cosa Nostra in the United States have been able to break the law with almost certain impunity. There are 3 main reasons why they have seldom gone to jail for their crimes. First is the layer upon layer insulation with which the mafia leaders protect themselves. The normal family structure is so skillfully stratified that, for example, when a Cosa Nostra boss orders a murder, the actual triggerman may be 5 layers below him in the structure. Trying to trace a Cosa Nostra crime to the man who ordered it is like trying to fight your way through a maze, says a Justice Department official. Then, when we're beginning to get somewhere, there's a sudden, unexplained gangland murder, as the newspapers call it. We can deduce that the victim was a link in the chain who was destroyed to remove a possible witness we hadn't even reached in our investigation. A second major safeguard for the Cosa Nostra chieftains is sheer terrorism. Witnesses against mafiosi have a bad habit of disappearing, dying, or losing the spirit of cooperation. During the McClellan Committee hearings in 1958, for example, Senator Robert F. Kennedy, then counsel for the committee, questioned New York boss Thomas Three Finger Brown Lucchese about his arrest for the murder of a man named Louis Cerasulo in New York in 1928. According to the information that we have, said Kennedy, the wife and daughter of the murdered man identified Mr. Lucchese and his brother-in-law as the ones who committed the murder. But when they were finally brought into court, they refused to affirm the identification. Now that is the situation that existed, and I want to find out what Mr. Lucchese knows about it, said Lucchese. I decline to answer under the Fifth Amendment. The protection of constitutional guarantees, such as the Fifth Amendment, is the third major reason that mafia leaders have been able to stay out of prison. Spending millions of dollars in legal fees, the mafiosi have used and misused every safeguard written into the law to protect the civil liberties of ordinary citizens. The government's big offensive against these seemingly impregnable defenses has been a long time in preparation. Until 1957, when New York State Police surprised the Cosa Nostra leaders at their Grand Council meeting at Appalachian, few law enforcement authorities even believed that there was such a thing as a national mafia crime syndicate in the United States. On August 14, 1966, the Detroit Free Press ran a story about the Hazel Park racetrack and how it was facing fresh investigations amid long-standing allegations of mafia ties. Attorney General Frank J. Kelly has called for a grand jury to probe claims of horse doping, bribery, and obstruction at the track. Despite previous inquiries finding no direct evidence of illegal operations or misconduct among Hazel Park's owners, former Detroit Police Commissioner George Edwards testified that the track serves as a front for mafia activities. The origins of Hazel Park involve figures linked to organized crime, adding to the controversy surrounding its management and financial dealings. Hazel Park, Story of a Troubled Track, the Detroit Free Press. The Hazel Park racetrack is once again a public question. Since the track was founded in 1949, the Hazel Park Racing Association and its ownership have been investigated by 3 state racing commissioners, the Detroit Police Department, and 2 committees of the United States Senate. Now, new investigations are being scheduled. Attorney General Frank J. Kelly has petitioned successfully for a one-man grand jury in Oakland County to investigate reports of illegal activities at the track. Kelly's petition stated that his information and belief were that horses had been drugged to manipulate races, state employees had been bribed to overlook law violations, and unknown persons had conspired to obstruct justice. In addition to the grand jury investigation, State Racing Commissioner Joseph Childs must decide whether to seek the removal of Hazel Park directors whose reputations have been called into question. None of the previous investigations found evidence that the track was being operated illegally or that its owners were violating the law. Although some Hazel Park stockholders in the past have had criminal records, there has been no proof of wrongdoing or any prosecution involving the track. Why the investigation? Perhaps the most serious accusation against Hazel Park was made by former Detroit Police Commissioner George Edwards, now a judge with the United States Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. Testifying before a Senate committee in October 1963, Edwards described Hazel Park as a classic example of mafia infiltration of legitimate enterprise. He said that much of the track's profits were available to further mafia power in the Detroit area. Edwards's sworn testimony before the committee included a prepared statement in which he said in part, "The Detroit area mafia of the 1960s is big business. On the legal side, it is involved in selling everything from horse races to fruit juice. On the illegal side, everything from dope to football bets. However, the mafia's principal product is fear." Edwards continued, "We must emphasize that we are by no means charging that every one of the 84 persons whom we will name today as mafia members or associates is privy to all of the mafia activities or crimes. We are confident, on the contrary, that knowledge of top-level activities and crimes is held to an absolute minimum number of essential personnel. We do assert that no person whom we name could be innocent of knowledge of the general criminal nature of the mafia's activities." Before the committee, Edwards named 81 men as members or associates of the Detroit Mafia, 3 names short of the 84 listed in his prepared statement. Among those named were 4 Hazel Park stockholders. 3 other major stockholders were not named by Edwards, but were directly related to men Edwards called Mafia Dons, or bosses. Edwards said before the Senate committee what no one else had proven, that Hazel Park was infiltrated by the Mafia. Testimony before committees of Congress is privileged, meaning no proof of its accuracy is required, and the Speaker cannot be sued for libel. Hazel Park's management was outraged by Edwards' testimony and challenged him to prove it. The association offered to open the books and financial records of the track's 9 officers and directors, provided Edwards would agree to retract his Senate testimony if nothing was found. Edwards refused, saying the offer was not material to his allegations. Background and ownership. Because of the police commissioner's testimony, Governor Romney ordered Barry Beeman, who resigned this month as racing commissioner, to investigate the track's ownership. Soon after, Edwards was appointed to the federal judgeship. Beeman's investigation found no evidence to support legal action against the track or its stockholders. The question remained, who owned Hazel Park? Hazel Park was born in 1948, when a dozen Detroit and Oakland County businessmen formed a corporation to build a sports stadium, possibly for racing midget cars. Later that year, Waldo Andrews, a former automobile dealer who was an admitted illegal bookmaker, learned that the corporation had a letter of intention from Louis Breton, who was then racing commissioner, stating it could get a horse track license. Andrews also discovered the corporation needed additional money to complete its plant. Andrews secured an option to buy out the stadium group and another option to purchase land in the track neighborhood. He brought in a fellow auto dealer and horseman, Richard A. Connell, now president of Hazel Park, into the deal. Then Andrews went to his attorney, the late John R. Monahan, for help. Monahan was a law partner of the late James V. Belanca, who ultimately became a prime mover in Hazel Park's growth. Belanca and Monahan decided to go into the deal after Andrews approached them. At a conference with Andrews and Connell, it was decided that Monahan and Belanca would try to raise $300,000 and that Andrews and Connell would also bring in investors. By the corporation's first meeting in 1949, Belanca and Monaghan had raised their $300,000. Of the $804,900 worth of stock on the company books in early 1949, A clear majority, $570,000 worth, was in the names of Connell, Andrews, Monaghan, and Belanca. By the time the track opened in August 1949, the financing had increased to $1,600,000. From records and from various investigations into the financing of Hazel Park, this much is known. Belanca had raised $50,000 from Anthony Zerilli, who borrowed the money in cash from his father, Joseph Zerilli, one of the men named by Edwards as a mafia boss. Joseph Zerilli was identified in Senate exhibits as a Prohibition-era hoodlum and partner in the illegal beer business with William, Black Bill Tocco, another mafia boss. Anthony Zerilli was not named by Edwards. Recalling his original purchase of Hazel Park stock, Anthony Zerilli testified that he was attending a wedding or some other social event at the Sheraton Cadillac Hotel when he heard from Belanca about the chance to invest in the track. Zerilli testified, "He, Belanca, mentioned to me, and that happened after my father had talked to me about loaning the money for an investment if I saw fit, and he, Belanca, thought it was a good investment for me to make. He talked to me and told me that if I knew anybody that had some money, or if I wanted to invest some money, he had a very good deal, and it pertained to racing in the state of Michigan." At the time he first bought Hazel Park stock, Anthony Zerilli was 21 years old. He had just become engaged to be married, an event that, he said, prompted his father to tell him that since he was to assume family responsibilities, if he saw a good investment or business, his father would loan him money to invest.